I was on a business trip abroad when I got an email from my parents. I remember the moment so clearly. I had just come back to my hotel room after a long day of meetings when I opened my laptop to check my emails. There it was, an email from Mom and Dad. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but the message hit me like a punch to the gut. They told me that they had sold my beach villa. Yes, my villa. They sold it to pay off my sister's gambling debts. They even added, "You didn't need it anyway, did you?" I just sat there staring at the screen, not believing what I was reading. That villa wasn't just a property to me, it was my dream home. I worked so hard to buy it, saving every penny for years. It was the one place where I felt at peace, a little escape from the rest of the world. And now, it was gone. Sold. Without even asking me. What made it worse was the casual tone of the email, like it wasn't a big deal. They didn't even wait for my response, didn't ask for my opinion, nothing. They just went ahead and sold it, like it was a small favor they did for me. I couldn't believe it. I felt betrayed, hurt, and incredibly angry. How could they do this to me? How could they think that I wouldn't mind losing something I had worked so hard for? I wanted to scream, cry, and throw something, but instead I sat there, frozen, my mind racing with questions. My parents, the people I trusted most, had done this behind my back. And that was just the beginning of what they didn't know. After reading that email, the first thing I did was try to call my parents. I needed to hear them explain themselves. I couldn't believe they would just sell my beach villa without talking to me first. My hands were shaking as I dialed their number, but no one answered. I called again and again, but nothing, just their voicemail. It felt like they were avoiding me, which only made things worse. I tried calling my sister too. She didn't pick up either. That wasn't unusual for her, but given everything that was happening, her silence felt suspicious. Why wasn't she saying anything? She was the reason they sold my villa in the first place. I wanted to know what she had to say about it, but it was like she had disappeared. Day after day, I kept trying to reach them, but they continued to dodge my calls. It felt like they had completely abandoned me. I started wondering if they had planned this all along, if they had conspired together to sell the villa and keep me in the dark. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just the sale of the villa that hurt, it was the fact that my own family had done this behind my back. How could they betray me like this? Eventually I realized I couldn't rely on them to give me any answers. They were avoiding me, and I couldn't sit around waiting for them to come clean. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to a lawyer for legal advice. I wanted to know if what they did was even legal. Could they just sell my property without my permission? The lawyer told me that I had every right to report the sale to the authorities, especially if it was done without my consent. That was exactly what I needed to hear. I knew I had to protect myself, and if my own family wasn't going to do the right thing, I would make sure someone else did. So I reported the sale. I didn't want to, but at that point, I felt like I had no other choice. My parents and sister had left me no other option. There's something my family didn't know about the beach villa, something I had never told anyone. Before I left on my business trip, I had hidden something incredibly valuable there. My inheritance. It wasn't just some small amount of money, it was everything I had saved up over the years, and I had kept it secret from everyone, even my family. I didn't trust anyone with it, not after everything I'd seen with my sister's gambling problem. That money was supposed to be my safety net, my backup plan if anything ever went wrong in life. I had hidden the money in a place I thought no one would ever find, inside the villa, in a spot I felt was completely secure. I never thought I'd have to worry about it. But when my parents sold the villa without telling me, my heart sank. All I could think about was that money. What if it was gone forever? What if the new owners found it? I felt sick to my stomach just thinking about it. I couldn't tell anyone about it. If I told my parents, they'd wonder why I kept it a secret in the first place, and I couldn't trust my sister with that information either. I was stuck. How could I get my money back without anyone finding out about it? The more I thought about it, the more desperate I became. I spent days trying to figure out a way to retrieve it. I considered going back to the villa pretending I needed to pick something up, but the new owners had already moved in. I even thought about hiring someone to help me, but how could I explain it without revealing everything? Every day that passed felt like a ticking clock. I had no idea if the money was still there or if it had already been discovered. I kept replaying all the scenarios in my head, trying to come up with a solution, but nothing seemed to work. The fear of losing everything was overwhelming. That inheritance was my future, my protection, and now it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I knew I had to act fast, but I couldn't make any mistakes. If I did, not only would I lose the money, but I'd also have to explain why I hid it in the first place. I knew I had to find out more about the new owner of the villa, so I decided to contact them directly. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I had to try something. Maybe I could figure out if they had found the hidden money or if there was still a chance for me to retrieve it. When I finally got in touch with the new owner, things took a turn I wasn't expecting. The more I talked to them, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. The person who bought the villa didn't seem like an average buyer. They were too familiar with my sister's situation, and as we continued talking, I started piecing things together. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a random sale. The new owner was connected to my sister's gambling ring. He wasn't just interested in buying the property, he had been after it for a completely different reason. My villa had become a target, part of some bigger plan that I hadn't even realized was happening. As I listened to him talk, my heart sank. Could my own sister have set this up? The thought made my stomach turn. It wasn't just about her gambling debts anymore. There was something much darker going on. The villa was more valuable to them than I had ever imagined, and now it was gone, sold to someone who was working with the very people my sister owed money to. It was then that I started to question everything. Had my parents known all along? Did they help her with this? Was the whole thing a setup from the start? I couldn't believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. They dodged my calls, avoided giving me answers, and sold the villa without a second thought. It wasn't just carelessness, it was a conspiracy. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My own family had betrayed me, not just in selling the villa, but in using me for their own gain. The very people I trusted most had been working against me all along, and I was left alone to pick up the pieces. Everything started to make sense, but it only left me with more questions. How deep did this go? And how far were they willing to go to cover it up? After learning the truth about the new owner of the villa, I knew I had to confront my parents and sister. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. I arranged a meeting with them at my parents' house, and when I walked in, the tension in the air was thick. I could tell from their faces that they knew what was coming. I didn't waste any time. I asked them point blank why they sold my villa without telling me, and why the buyer was connected to my sister's gambling ring. At first, they tried to deny everything, but I wasn't having it. I pressed harder, and eventually, the truth started to spill out. My parents, looking ashamed and broken, confessed that they had been blackmailed into selling the villa. My sister's criminal associates had threatened them, telling them that if they didn't sell the property and use the money to pay off her debts, something terrible would happen to them. They were scared, and I could see that fear in their eyes as they told me the story. But as much as I wanted to feel sorry for them, I couldn't. Because then came the real betrayal, the part that shattered me even more. They admitted that along with the threats, they were also offered a bribe. These people didn't just want to scare them into selling the villa. They also promised my parents a significant amount of money if they went through with it. And my parents took it. They sold my dream home, my hard-earned property, not just because they were afraid, but because they saw a way to profit from it. I felt my heart drop. The betrayal wasn't just about desperation, it was about greed. My parents chose to save themselves and make a little extra money on the side, all at my expense. They didn't even think to ask me, to let me know what was going on. They took the easy way out, sacrificed my villa, and then stayed silent about the whole thing. My sister sat there saying nothing, her head hung low. I wanted to scream at her to make her explain herself, but deep down, I already knew. She was in too deep with these people, and now my parents had been dragged into it too. But what hurt the most was that none of them had thought about me. They didn't care that they were taking away something I had worked so hard for. They only cared about saving themselves. As I stood there facing my family, I realized how alone I really was. The people I had trusted my whole life, the people who were supposed to have my back, had turned on me. They had made a choice, a selfish, greedy choice, and I was the one who had to pay the price. I walked out of that house feeling numb. The villa was gone, the money was gone, and so was my trust in them. It was the darkest betrayal I could have imagined, and there was no going back from it. After everything came out, the blackmail, the bribe, the betrayal, I knew I couldn't just sit back and accept it. My family had turned on me, and my sister's criminal connections had taken everything I had worked for, but I wasn't going to let them win. I was hurt, angry, and determined to get back what was mine. I knew I had to take action, and the only way to do that was to fight back, legally and smartly. I spent days thinking about what to do next. My first instinct was to confront my sister again, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. She was too deep in with those criminals, and talking to her would only make things worse. So instead, I decided to take a different approach. I was going to expose her criminal connections and take legal action against everyone involved, the corrupt people who bought my villa and those who forced my family into this mess. The first step was gathering evidence. I started digging into everything: old emails, bank records, anything that could give me a clearer picture of what had happened. I even checked the villa's sale records to see if there were any irregularities. It wasn't easy, and I had to be careful not to tip anyone off, but I was determined. I couldn't let them get away with this. Once I had enough information, I knew I couldn't do it alone. So I decided to quietly reach out to the authorities. I met with a detective who specialized in cases like this: financial crimes, shady deals, criminal rings. I told him everything I knew and handed over all the evidence I had collected. He assured me that they would look into it and start investigating the people behind the sale. Working with the authorities gave me a sense of control again. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like I was actually doing something to fight back. I stayed in close contact with them, feeding them more information whenever I found something new. They started digging deeper into my sister's connections and the people who bought the villa, and it became clear that this was bigger than just my family's betrayal. There was a whole web of corruption, and I was determined to untangle it. But I had to be patient. I couldn't rush things no matter how much I wanted to. Exposing these people would take time, and I had to make sure everything was done legally and carefully. I kept my plan quiet, not even telling my parents what I was up to. They had made their choice, and I couldn't trust them anymore. As the investigation unfolded, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and, strangely, relief. I was hurt, but I was also taking back control of my life. I wasn't going to let my sister or her criminal associates ruin everything I had worked for. This was my fight now, and I was ready for it. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to see it through. I was going to get justice no matter what it took. As the investigation started picking up steam, I noticed something strange. At first, it was just a gut feeling, a sense that something was off. I'd catch glimpses of the same car following me down the street, or I'd see the same person lingering near my apartment. It was subtle at first, but soon it became clear that I was being followed. The closer I got to the truth, the more the threats began. It started with anonymous phone calls, people warning me to back off, telling me I didn't know what I was getting into. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the threats became more serious. I'd find strange notes on my car, and one time someone even tried to break into my apartment. It was terrifying. I quickly realized this wasn't just about the villa anymore. The people who had pushed my family into selling it weren't just some small-time crooks. They were part of something much bigger. They didn't want me digging into their dealings, and they were willing to do anything to stop me. That's when I realized my life was in danger. These people weren't playing games. They had already manipulated my family, taken my home, and now they were after me. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my family. My parents had already chosen their side, and my sister was too deep in this mess to help me. I was alone, and it was terrifying. I had to be careful. Every move I made felt like a risk, and I started looking over my shoulder constantly. But even with the danger, I knew I couldn't stop. I was too far into this to turn back now. I couldn't let them win, no matter how scared I was. The authorities were working on the case, but I had to protect myself in the meantime. Navigating this world of crime and deceit was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I went from being a successful businesswoman to someone who was fighting just to survive. It was hard to wrap my head around how everything had spiraled so far out of control. My family had fallen apart, and the people I loved had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. I didn't know who to trust anymore, so I decided to trust no one. Every step forward felt like I was walking through a minefield, but I refused to give up. I knew that if I stopped now, these criminals would get away with everything. They'd win, and I'd lose everything I'd worked for. My home, my security, my peace of mind. I couldn't let that happen. I had to stay strong, even if I was scared out of my mind. But as the threats grew more intense, I started to wonder how far they'd go. Would they really hurt me? What was I willing to risk to see this through? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I was alone in this fight, and I had to rely on myself to get through it. There was no turning back now. After weeks of living in fear, looking over my shoulder, and feeling like I was constantly being watched, I finally had a breakthrough. With the help of the authorities, we gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation. It was a massive criminal network, and my sister was tangled up in it deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about gambling debts anymore. It was about money laundering, fraud, and a whole web of deceit that went far beyond my villa. I had to be smart. Every move I made was calculated, knowing that one wrong step could cost me everything, my life, my future, and any chance of justice. I worked closely with the detectives, providing them with every piece of information I had. We set a trap. And when the time was right, the police made their move. It was a dark victory. The criminal ring was taken down, and my lost inheritance, the money I had hidden in the villa, was recovered. I should have felt relief, maybe even triumph, but all I could feel was a deep emptiness. I had won the fight, but it had come at such a high cost. My relationship with my family was completely shattered. My parents couldn't look me in the eye, and my sister, well, she was facing legal consequences for her involvement in the criminal activities. The family I had grown up with, the people I thought I could trust, were no longer there for me. They had chosen their path, and it led to this destruction. What hurt the most wasn't just the loss of the villa or the money. It was the realization that I had seen this coming all along. Deep down, I had always known my sister would lead the family to ruin. Her reckless behavior, her gambling, her lies, it had been building up for years. I had tried to ignore it, hoping things would change, but in the end, I was right. I survived the chaos, but it changed me. I became cold, distant, and untrusting of anyone, even those I used to be closest to. How could I ever trust again when the people who were supposed to protect and love me had betrayed me so deeply? It felt like a part of me had been lost in the process, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever get it back. I had outsmarted my enemies, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a hollow win. one that left me isolated and wary of the world around me. I wasn't the same person anymore. I had been forced to fight for what was mine, and in the end, I came out on top. But the cost was my family, my trust, and a part of myself that I wasn't sure I'd ever recover. Now I move forward alone, knowing that I can only rely on myself. I survived, but the victory came with a darkness I'll carry with me forever.